All right, thank you all for your patience and my chaos this morning. First order of business, leftovers from Wednesday night. Russ asked a fantastic question about proselytes, what tribe they were put into. Got an answer for you. Of sorts. Not an official, specific command, but we do have an indication from Ezekiel. I'll give this to you when I'm done. Ezekiel 47, beginning in verse 21, says this. Now this is talking about the future kingdom in a prophetic sense, so again it's not super specific, but here's the idea. Thus you shall divide this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. It shall be that you will divide it by lot as an inheritance for yourselves, and for the strangers who dwell among you, proselytes, and who bear children among you. They shall be to you as native born among the children of Israel. They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. And it shall be that in whatever tribe the stranger dwells, there you shall give him his inheritance, says the Lord God. So basically it's kind of what we were talking about, where if you wanted to become a proselyte, let's say there was one of the leftover, Canaanites that was in the land, or someone who just moved into the land, they wanted to be a proselyte, they would go through that process, and then the land of Israel was divided up into tribes, and that land always stayed within the tribe. So if you were in, the land of Ephraim, and you became a proselyte, you would be adopted into the tribe of Ephraim. Make sense? We were pretty close. Okay. Next order of business. Now we're going to be getting into the class. Again, what we're doing here is we're going through how to study the Bible so that we can prepare ourselves, equip ourselves, get the knowledge, and get the confidence to then go and share the Bible with other people. And what? Do I have those? The old ones for today? I thought I gave them. These here? Okay. This will be, it says class number 3, it's really class number 2. All right. Okay. We're in the essence of organization today. Okay, so yeah, the handout says class number 3 because I'm using material from another class, but we're condensing and kind of hitting the highlights. What we're going to talk about today, Lord willing, is Bible translations. I did not bring my poncho for the tomatoes, so I'm just going to have to rely on my reflexes to dodge the incoming. But we need to understand about some things about translation. Why are there so many translations? You may talk to somebody who doesn't have a lot of Bible knowledge or experience, and they say, why are there so many translations? It's a good question, and it's one we need to be prepared to answer. Many of us know the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. How many people speak Hebrew? How many people speak Greek? I know a little bit of it, a smattering. I can't really speak it. So we need translations if we're going to know what God wanted us to know, right? So translations is a necessary thing, a necessary process. We need to understand 2 very important terms and the difference between it, translation and a version. What's the difference? A translation is simply taking any writing or book from one language to another. If I take an English King James Bible and translate it into Spanish, that's a translation. A version of the Bible is going back to the original language and translating it. See, I can make a translation of, again, the English Bible to Spanish, and I can take that Spanish translation and translate that into Japanese. Those are all translations, but to go back to the original, that's what you get a version from. So we just need to remember that a version is sort of higher up on the chain because it is closer to the original. It goes back to the original language. So if you go back to the Greek to translate the New Testament into some language, that's a version. It's important to understand this because every step away from the original it gives a possibility of error, because every time you translate something from one language into another, the words don't always match up. Well, there's not a word in English that perfectly correlates to that word in Hebrew, so you have to make a judgment call. You have to say, well, it's close enough to this, and it kind of means that. So you have to make those judgments, and every time you make a translation, you're getting further away from that. So the closer we can get back to the original, the better. And the more sure we are with what the message really was. This is a book on, this is probably one of the most valuable books in my entire library. It's called The General Introduction to the Bible by Geisler and Nix. This is really a gold standard work. This is everything you ever wanted to know about the Bible and more. It talks about the inspiration, prophecy, so many things, but it talks a lot about the versions and translation process and how we determine those things. If you're interested in this kind of topic, this is the book you need to have. But it talks about the differences again between translations and versions. I want to read, if you have a New King James Version, in the beginning pages of it, in the preface, in the introduction, they say something very important about translating. The New King James Version was a revision of the Old King James Version, but it says this in the introduction to the New King James. This is from 1979, copyright of the Thomas Nelson Publisher New King James Version Bible. The King James New Testament was based on the traditional text of the Greek-speaking churches, first published in 1516 and later called the Textus Receptus, or the received text. That term is very important. Textus Receptus is the collection of manuscripts. We talk about the manuscripts for the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. And over the years, there are old translation versions, portions, scraps that are copies of the original writing. Those are all the manuscript collections. One of those, there's two basic collections. We'll talk about this in a minute. There is the Textus Receptus, which is a collection of manuscripts. And then there's another body, which is referred to as the majority text. And we'll talk about the difference of those in a minute. So the New King James says, King James was based upon the Textus Receptus. Then it says, since the 1880s, most contemporary translations of the New Testament have relied upon a relatively few manuscripts discovered chiefly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Such translations depend primarily on two manuscripts, the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, because of their greater age. Both of those are from the 4th century. However, some scholars have grounds for doubting the faithfulness of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, since they often disagree with one another. And Sinaiticus exhibits excessive omission. That means there are chunks that are missing. A third viewpoint of the New Testament scholarship holds that the best text is based on the consensus of the majority of existing manuscripts. That's basically everything that they have completely collected. Good copies, bad copies, old copies, young copies, many different languages. They take all of them together and they say all of them, the best collection is Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1 reads this way. There's a few variants, a few different ones, but 99% of them translated this way, so this is the way we're going to translate it. That's the theory. That text is called the majority text. The majority text is similar to the Textus Receptus. I would even say it's extremely similar. But it corrects those readings which have little or no support in the manuscript, in the Greek manuscript tradition. In light of these facts, and also because the New King James Version is the 5th revision of a historic document translated from specific Greek texts, the editors decided to retain the traditional text in the body of the New Testament and to indicate major critical and majority text variant readings in the center reference column. What that means is that when you have a New King James, it will show you, it'll have a footnote by a verse, it'll have a little asterisk or a bracket, and it'll say the majority text reads this way. and there'll be a slightly different variant reading. So it shows you what the variant is. By giving a clearly defined set of variants, the New King James Version benefits readers of all textual persuasions. Where significant variations occur in the New Testament Greek manuscripts, textual notes are classified as follows. There is the NU text. That'll be a note that's in there sometimes, which refers to a body of text manuscripts. Then there is M text, which refers to the majority text. So if you see a note that says M text reads this, NU text reads this, that's these other collections of manuscripts. What does that mean? Why is it important? It just tells you that even the people who made the New King James Version realized that there were disputes about some things. There were some different philosophies about how to translate the Bible. They acknowledged this and recognized it. I appreciate that. Before we get into the translations, we want to mention a couple of ancient works. Which handout is it? Let's see here. The handout that has the things going down into the V, principal sources of English versions of the Bible. Look at that for just a minute. There's really two that we need to look at. This is fascinating, and I'll leave that for your fascination later on. But what I want you to focus on here is primarily two works. One is the Septuagint. You've heard me reference this before. It'll often be abbreviated LXX. That's the Roman numerals for 70. The idea, the tradition was that there were 70 of the greatest Bible scholars that got together to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, which was the language of the time. Hebrew Old Testament translated into Greek, which would make it a version, really, technically. Another work is the Latin Vulgate. The word Vulgate is Latin, meaning, we get the idea of vulgar from it. We think that as bad and gross, but really it just means common, like street language. So this was done in 382 AD by a Catholic priest named Jerome. And he used Hebrew for the Old Testament. He translated the Bible, and he used Hebrew for the Old Testament, but he also did include some Old Latin translations of the Bible, of the Old Testament, in his Old Testament translation. In Jerome's New Testament, that was basically a revision of an Old Latin version. So you've got Jerome using a version that took the original Greek, translated into a form called Old Latin, and then he used that to translate into a newer version of Latin. So it is only a translation. It is not a version. It's important to remember. Latin Vulgate is the basis for many of our modern translations. So basic on this chart, all you need to see is its youngest in the middle and its oldest to the outside. So if you look at this, you see the Old Testament begins way back with the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then the Greek Septuagint again, 250 BC. Then there's the Masoretic text. Now we're getting towards the intertestamental period, where, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the people that were writing those, they used something called the Masoretic text, a version of Hebrew where they had the little accent marks and things. And then we have in the middle these different translations, and you see what went towards what. And again, you have the ones using the youngest bodies of text. Youngest means more recent to our time, which means further away from the original. So as you start at the top and work your way down, they get closer and closer. They get older, basically. They're based on older manuscripts. When you get all the way down to the bottom, the newer versions, like the Revised Standard, New American Standard, English Standard Version, RSV, those kind of things are based on actually older bodies of manuscript. And the ones higher up the chain, Wycliffe Tyndale's translation, the Geneva Bible, they were based on younger manuscript evidence. We'll talk about that in a minute, just why that's such a big deal. So that just shows you where they came from, which versions use which basis of manuscript. I'm going to try to make this not so dry and boring and technical, but it may be a struggle for me. All right, any questions so far? Okay, So let's talk about the versions now. Let's talk about the different versions. Where should we start? What's everybody's favorite version? Throw some out. King James. Well, let's just start right off the bat. Sounds great. The King James Version was also referred to as the Authorized Version. You see it sometimes just abbreviated AV. Well, the AV says it's the Authorized Version, King James 1611. It was commissioned by King James in England for a new translation of the Bible. It's called the King, here's the blockbuster. Hold on, fasten your seatbelts, okay? The King James Version is not technically a version at all. Actually, it is a translation. What the King James Version actually is they took a previous version of the Bible, which was called the Bishop's Bible, and they revised it, they updated it, they tweaked it and polished it. They referenced the original Greek when they felt it was necessary to clarify a passage. But it was not going from the Greek over here into the King James Version. The Greek, translate that here into the King James. That's not the way they did it. And even if you, this is a facsimile copy of the original 1611. It's really cool, it's really small. But the 1611 version, the title page of the original edition states that it is not the King James Version, but that it is a translated. The Holy Bible, containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues, with the former translations diligently compared and revised. So it says they did consult some of the old tongues, the original languages, but also some of the newer translations. So they even acknowledged in the King James Version that it was not a version, but a translation. Doesn't mean it's bad. Hold on, hold your fire. When you look into the section of the introduction again that refers to the notes to the reader in the King James Version, there's a purpose statement, and it states there that the committee that formulated the King James Version never intended to make a new translation. That was not their goal. They only sought to make a good one better. The good one would be the Bishop's Bible. They said, we want to tweak and polish this and make it a little better and more accurate and more readable. So, there are those who take the King James only position and say the King James, if it was good enough for Paul, it was good enough for me. That's a joke. But they said the King James is the most accurate, and that's the only one that's authoritative, and that's the one we need to use, and all these other modern translations aren't worth a hoot. That same attitude of inerrancy that some would say that the King James Version basically came right down from the hand of God and put down on the paper in the form that we have it. It was divinely inspired just like the original manuscripts. There was the same type of attitude of inerrancy, that it was infallible, it was divinely given, that God was overseeing the process of the translation. There was that same attitude about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament in 250 BC. There was the same attitude, and it was just as incorrect there as it is here. So some would say, well, whenever you start bringing up problems or, some things about the King James Version, you start talking about the Greek and this word, this Greek word and that Greek word and the tense, and it requires everybody to be a Greek scholar to see these so-called problems that you find in the King James Version. Well, that's not true. That's an over-exaggeration. But should we not benefit from those who are Greek scholars and the work that they've done in this area? I think that would be wise of us to do so. What I would like to do with all of these versions, we're going to look at several of them. I'm not just going to pick on the King James here. I'll pick on everybody fairly. What I'd like to do is offer some pros and cons as I see them. All I can do is give you my opinion on this. That's for you to decide, but I'll try to show fairly some of the good things and the bad things about every translation, because every translation has good and bad things about it. But I do fully recognize that these are my understanding and my opinion. I think one of the greatest things about the King James Version is the fact that it's been around for 400 years. They had these at Walmart about 4 or 5 years ago around Easter time, And it was celebrating 400 years of the, well, it was 2011, I guess, obviously. 400 years of the original King James Version of the Bible. $5. They had these, I bought like half a dozen copies, and I've been giving them out to people. But yeah, 400 years. So people are familiar with it. Many people are familiar. Even people who don't, even people who have never read the Bible, who've never darkened the doorway of a church building, recognize some of the phraseology that's used in the King James Version. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. They may have no idea what the word begotten means, but they know that that's the word that comes next. There's a familiarity with many, many people, millions of people around the world. And there is a sort of a sense of tradition around the King James Version of the Bible. I'm going to keep calling it a version, even though I said earlier that it's technically not, because it's just how we've come to accept and identify it. But there's a sense of tradition about it, and that's not always a bad thing. Tradition is not always bad. There's a level of comfort with that. Some people feel more comfortable speaking in that way in a church setting, or praying, saying the word thee and thou and things, or thy Father, things like this. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's something that the King James Version has encouraged, and it's not a bad thing always. I would say that from just a literary aspect, I don't think that there is any finer example of English literature than the King James Bible. When you take the works of Shakespeare or any other thing like that, it all pales in comparison to just simply the literary accomplishment and the beauty of what we find in the King James Bible. It's much more than that, but it's also at least that. It's a beautiful example of classic English, and many people have memorized verses, memory verses from the King James Bible, because there's a predictable rhythm to it. There is sort of a poetic cadence and a rhythm to the way the verses are translated. And again, we call to mind the way the words follow one another. And that's something that is a good thing. It's also a very literal translation. I'm not knocking the accuracy of it at all. The King James Version is an extremely accurate translation when compared to the original, not the original, to the ancient manuscripts. You don't have the originals, unfortunately, the autographs. So those are some of the pros, what are some of the cons? Again, this is my opinion. Sometimes I find the King James Version to be literal almost to a fault. There are uses of what are often referred to as ecclesiastical words. The propitiation of sin. What does that mean? How many people know what that means? Probably have an idea, you could probably work it out, but we don't use that kind of words. We don't use those kind of phrases in our everyday conversation. So it can often be very confusing. And what you have to do is you read something and then you have to explain what that means. We found this when we were in Jamaica, dealing with people. A lot of them are very familiar with the King James Version, and the church there encourages us to use the King James Version when talking to people, just because there will be a greater familiarity with it. So I don't know how many times we're studying with somebody and we read a passage and we say, so here's what this says, and we go, and this word here means this. So you have to translate for them as you're speaking. That can often be confusing. There are some archaic words that are used there. In the King James, you'll find the word hoarfrost. How many times have you used the word hoarfrost in your everyday conversation? Turn very briefly with me to James chapter 1, verse 21. And I want somebody who has the King James Version to read James 1:21.
Wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with mercy the engrafted word which is able to save your souls.
Superfluity of naughtiness. When was the last time you uttered that phrase? Boy, the children were just giving me such a hard time today, man. They were just superfluity of naughtiness all over the place. It means an excess of wickedness. But again, that's one of those things you have to translate. Oh, this is what it says, but it really means this. It sort of makes an extra step. it requires translation, if you will, into modern speech. Not that it's a bad thing, it just can be a little cumbersome sometimes, especially people that don't have a background in the Bible. Looking at the bodies of manuscripts, again, we've got the Textus Receptus that are based on fewer copies of younger manuscripts, that means more recent. And then there is the majority and the NU text that are based on more copies, not always complete copies. All the time there's a lot of fragments, but there's more copies, and they are older, that is, they are closer to the original. Two different schools of thought on that. But the King James Version is based on younger and academically recognized as being slightly, ever so slightly less reliable manuscripts in the Textus Receptus, simply saying that there are older, more accurate copies out there. Not that it's bad, just not the best, perhaps. We can say that with respect. Another book I want to point out to you is this one by James White. This is called The King James Only Controversy, another really, really good book. For the most part, he does a pretty good job. He does get a tiny, tiny bit snippy, snotty, maybe. Not arrogant, not condescending and insulting, but there's just a little bit of snark that creeps in on occasion when he talks about those who are just stubbornly hard-headed, that the King James is the only thing a real Christian ought to use. But the book is very, very good. And what he has a phrase that he uses that I like in there. He calls them expansions of piety. And this would be a place where a copyist, way back in the days of old, was taking a manuscript and was translating it into another language, was copying it, writing it down, and there was something that he saw was sort of missing something. Filling in the blanks is really what this is. Where the text would simply say the word Christos, which is Christ, and the scribe would, instead of just writing the word Christ, he would write Jesus Christ, or the Lord Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing false or erroneous about writing that in, except that it's not in the original. And this occurs very often in those other manuscripts. Again, so nothing wicked, nothing evil intent behind it. It's simply adding something that wasn't originally in there. And this occurs often in the Textus Receptus. There are also attempts at harmonization. You know, they read the Gospels, and they're not exactly identical. They're not photocopies of each other. What you find is there are slight differences. Different people mentioned in certain places. Well, they go into Jericho, and there's one blind guy. And then another Bible writer will say, well, no, there was two blind guys going into Jericho. Well, which is right? Well, they're both right. They just both weren't mentioned. And what happens in those times is you'll find an attempt to harmonize the two. When someone is copying Matthew, and then he would get to Mark, and he would be in the same place that he just got done copying from Matthew, and he would see that Mark left out this little detail about something, so he would helpfully add it in for the help of the reader to understand what's going on there. Again, the problem is that it wasn't in the original Mark manuscript. It wasn't evil, it wasn't false, it just simply wasn't there. And it was added in. Also, another big knock between King James Version, Textus Receptus based translations, and some of the newer versions are they say that a lot of the newer versions, like the New International Version, English Standard Version, well, they leave out a bunch of stuff. Excessive omission. They say, oh, we can't trust the English Standard Version because it leaves out a bunch of stuff. It leaves out a bunch of stuff from the King James Version. That's true. But many of the things that the newer versions omit and leave out are these additions that didn't belong in the original manuscript. Somebody posted online a thing about you can't trust the new versions, and here's all the things that the English Standard Version leaves out. And I printed this out, and I wanted to answer them just for my own benefit. And I've got a lister of all these things, all these verses that are supposedly left out of the new translations that you can't trust them. Every single one of them, what you will find is that what was left out was what's called an interpolation, where again, there was a scribe, there was a writer, and he wrote a little note out in the margin to himself, or maybe something to go ask, the bishop a question about, is this really what this means? Does this belong in here? Or making a cross-reference, like your Bible has cross-references. Sort of these little marginal notes. And then the next guy who got that copy saw that little note in the side and said, oh, well, that must belong in there. So he would just put it in helpfully wherever that belonged. And then the next guy just copied what he saw, and that interpolation was then put into the body of text. And well, that must be the way it was written. So, and on those copies go. That's how it happens over time. So these interpolations, these things that were added in that really shouldn't have been added in, that is often what is left out of the new translations. I'm using air quotes a lot today, sorry. Probably quite annoying. So all of these verses, you'll find this. And there's also those things where they'll say, well, this version here just says Jesus. It doesn't say the Lord Jesus. So it's denying the divinity, denying the deity of Christ. No, it's just that the original manuscript just said the name Jesus. It didn't have the word kurios there. So a lot of those things that are omitted from the newer versions are those kinds of things. One of the big discussions, one of the big debates is about 1 John chapter 5. Turn over to 1 John 5 real quick. 1 John 5 verses 7 and 8. This is one that just really strikes at the heart of some people and really gets them going. 1 John 5, 7 and 8. Can someone read that from the King James Version, please?
For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. What did you say, 7 through 9?
7 through 8. 7 and 8.
And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these agree in one. And these three agree in one.
Okay. These three are one, is the main discussion there. These three are one. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. These three are one. The original text doesn't have that in there. Let me read to you what, this is the New American Standard, which uses the majority text as the basis, and it says this: for there are three that testify, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three are in agreement. So it doesn't have the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. So people would say, well, these newer versions, they chop out that whole thing about the Trinity. So they teach against the Trinity. Listen to what Bruce Metzger, Bible scholar, I won't get into his credentials, but he's very trustworthy, but he says, in that passage, the word agree at the end of verse 8 should be translated by the English Standard Version, which it's not, which I didn't think to bring a copy with me. It should be translated to show the unique oneness, but the unity of the Trinity is still taught here, even if it's taught less clearly. And it's taught in numerous other places, like John chapter 10, verse 30, John 17:11, 17:22, several other places, many other places in the Bible, even in the English Standard Version, New American Standard, teach the doctrine of the Trinity. They just don't teach it here. And this is what Metzger says. I'll quote from what he says in his commentary, his textual commentary about this passage. The passage, 1 John 5, 7 and 8, is absent from every known Greek manuscript, except one from the 10th century, 6 from the 16th century, and 1 from the 18th century. So those who say, well, this verse belongs in the Bible about the Father, the Word, and Holy Spirit, these three are one. That belongs in there. It's only found in, what do we got? 8 manuscripts beginning in the 10th century. That's a long time from the original. And then you have 10 centuries previous to that of all of these other Greek manuscripts that don't have the verse in there. So it's just a matter of which way you want to go. You want to go with the younger, more complete manuscripts, or do you want to go with the older, less complete, but more numerous? And therefore, if you can compare, like if you've got one copy of the Codex Vaticanus, you've got one copy to use as your basis. Or you've got 10,000 copies that are older, that may not always be complete, and maybe fragments and things, but you put them all together in a collection, and you can see all of these copies say exactly the same thing. So we can say with pretty fair accuracy, that's probably what the original said. It's just two different schools of thought. And I'm not going to make that decision for you. So, that is the discussion about the King James Version. Now, I will say, for my own, well, I'll just say this is what I wrote to the guy after I did my study here. This is really a question of the Byzantine text, which is the majority. There's Byzantine and there's Alexandrian. Those are the two divisions. This is really a question of the Byzantine text, the older and far more numerous copies, versus the Alexandrian Textus Receptus, which is younger and fewer copies. Personally, I don't like the ESV to remove these from the text body, even if they don't belong. To respect tradition and the King James Version, I much prefer the New King James Version and the New American Standard Version approach of including them with brackets and explanatory footnotes which let the reader decide their validity. It's not so much a matter of the ESV omitting scriptures, but rather it's a matter of the King James Version being lax in allowing interpolations and marginal notes into the text which truly didn't belong there in the first place. But there is no loss of teaching. There's no loss of any teaching with those interpolations removed because they are restated elsewhere. Having said all that, I was converted to Christ with the King James Version Bible. I preach from the New King James Version. I study with the New American Standard Version, and my daily reader is an English Standard Version. So make of that what you will. The first Bible that I ever bought as a new Christian was a King James Version Bible. I love it. I revere it. But it's not always the best, most accurate, or useful translation for whatever I'm doing. It just depends. So again, I say we use them all. We use them all for the benefits that they have. So I've done all the talking, and I apologize for that. What are your thoughts on the King James Version? I know you have some. Come on. You're not fooling anybody. Out with it.
Well, most of us were probably brought up reading the King James Version, so we're more comfortable with it. And actually, if the parts that are added don't eliminate any of the truth of it, then it's not a big issue in that sense.
Right. It's not a big issue. And I'd say that there's value in that familiarity that you just mentioned. That's a plus. That's a big plus. And it shouldn't be overlooked. There's some people that just want to abandon, every tradition just because it's old, and that's a bad thing to do. Yes, please.
When you're dealing with people who have no religious background, they have no tradition whatsoever, the King James Version is extremely difficult to use. You spend more than that trying to explain English to them versus what the message is. And therefore, and that's what I mostly do. I'm in an area where there's very little knowledge of King James Version, so the English is so old, so antiquated that...
You got more Revised Standard Version, is that more what folks are familiar with up there? Kind of Lutheran territory?
Yeah. But even then, there's so many non-religious people, period, where they don't know anything. They can say, yeah, my parents are Lutheran, but they've never opened up a Bible in their life, even though they go on Easter and Christmas and things like that. So using a version that has American-based English is much more efficient.
That's a great point that I really hadn't thought about. I mean, I mentioned like when we were in Jamaica, but I mean, if you've only got a limited window, if you can get somebody to grace you with a Bible study, like, hey, okay, you got 30 minutes, go. And if you spend half of your time saying, well, that says this, but this is what it really means. This is what it really means. If you're translating those terms instead of teaching the gospel, you may not be getting the most, bang for your buck. So that's a valid point.
You've got these grade level equivalents for the translations on the next page, I actually disagree with those. I think it would be a stretch to say that most 12th graders can understand the NIV.
That's purely for, I have some issues with some of the rankings there as well, and just so for, that's
To
why.
say, I mean, it's easier for me because I grew up reading King James, so what seems to be complicated language is not really that much of but I do know some people who would need to begin to be able to describe it. But, so I agree, there are times where using, like I said, the New King James Version, just because it eliminates some of the A's, L's, and F's and things like that, is helpful. But, I mean, me personally, you know, I don't have an issue with reading that older language.
And sometimes that challenge is a good growth exercise to get into.
And I think you lose something when you get away from the old language, because the older words actually have more specific intent behind it.
We'll talk about that more when we get into some of the more modern versions, but yeah, we're only kind of grazing it today, but yeah, that's a good point.
You know, when I've gone through the Old Testament too, I've noticed some things in the Old Testament that don't quite make as much sense in the King James as they do in some of the newer versions. I know a lot of that's between whether they use the Septuagint or not. And sometimes I think there are times in the Septuagint that seem to make more sense than in the Masoretic text and otherwise. But
Which is a good reason for us to use all of them.
I do find that it typically is not a matter of faith. Yeah, usually the errors or the confusing parts aren't a matter of faith.
No.
So
But sometimes they are.
sometimes they are.
The overriding question for any translation or version is, can it cost you to lose your soul?
And that's a question we should ask.
And there are some that can.
Yeah.
And so those need to be eliminated. And the other ones could be used.
And we will talk about that when we get into some of the other translations as well, where there are some issues that are
Yeah.
important.
One thing that's brought up is you know the genealogy after Noah. There's some variations there, and it's not a matter of faith, really. You know, it's just a number of years and things like that.
So many of those places where there's any debate or disagreement about a certain passage or a verse or something, that's covered somewhere else. So there's no standalone teaching that is affected by any of these areas of dispute. And we'll talk about that more.
That goes back to no matter who you're teaching, you have to take the whole Bible in and use the whole Bible. You have to be able to teach from everywhere.
Right. Well, that's why I wanted to discuss all of these translations to see what the good and the bad and the ugly and all of the, you know, the why there are so many translations, what they're based on, and where they came from. But sometimes just knowing where they came from, especially when we get into some of the denominational translations, really open your eyes to some things that you need to be aware of. So thank you all for your attention and for not tar and feathering me. I appreciate your restraint there. We'll get on to it more next week. Thank you.
Okay. Both ways.
Right, it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
And it's like that with any version, with any translation, it's a trade-off. You just have to, I just want everybody to be aware of what those trade-offs are. And for what your purpose is. So I had to go back and restart the camera stand, asked me to record those while they're gone. All right, so American Standard. Now, the New American Standard of 1995 was a revision, and something that was really good that it did was it corrected some of the tenses of verbs, especially like a past tense, because there's different things in Greek. There's a perfect, there's a past tense, and it made it, and it smoothed out those past tenses to make them more readable in English, which was a good thing. But that's the American Standard. It's based on the majority text, the greater body of older manuscripts. They're not always complete. So that's that. Any questions on American Standard?
Both the King James and American Standard are word-for-word translations.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes, we'll talk about dynamic equivalence in just a second, but yeah, they are, the attempt is made there to take this Hebrew word into an English word, this Hebrew word into an English word, and the same with the Greek. It's the idea is to do a word-for-word translation to make as little judgment as possible and simply translate what the original writer wrote. Not necessarily what he meant, but what he wrote. That's the idea behind a literal word-for-word translation, which is really the best kind. Okay, New King James came along in 1979. This was a revision of the King James Version. The idea was to modernize it a little bit, to get rid of some of those things that we talked about as being sort of some cons of the King James was, for one thing, the language of it is very beautiful and very literary, but again, it can be a little clunky, it can be a little awkward when you're talking to someone who doesn't have a lot of Bible knowledge, who doesn't have a lot of exposure to it. You start talking about, we use James 1:21 about, the superfluity of naughtiness. You have to explain, you have to translate the translation. And that just sort of adds an extra step in evangelism, which may not have time to do that. So the New King James in 1979 was supposed to be a correction of that. They still use the same body of text. They still use the Textus Receptus. They were just simply trying to smooth out some of that older type of language. It's still very literal. It's a very accurate translation. The great thing about it is it retains the sentence structure of the King James Version. That's one of the greatest things about the King James Version is the sentence structure. Very familiar to people, especially people who are fans of the King James. So the New King James retains that same sentence structure, the same subject, verb, cadence, and the rhythm of it, but it just polishes it up a little bit and modernizes the language again. There's not, he seeketh. A lot of the F's are done away with. It removes some of those archaic type of terms and just modernizes the language. It also, because it was done in 1979, gives the reader the benefit of newer manuscript discoveries. That's one of the biggest differences between the Old King James Version and the New King James, is the New King James has explanatory footnotes that says, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of those discoveries, some of those things that shed some light on some of the questions about the variant readings. The New King James tells you that. It'll put things in brackets, it'll put an asterisk, it'll put a footnote, and it'll say, the majority text reads this way. Oh, well, that's good to know, because maybe I think that's a more accurate reading of it. Maybe that makes more sense to me. So I think the best thing of all of the New King James Version is that it adds everything in there. Because the argument you have many times is the King James Version has stuff in there, and then the newer versions chop it out, as some say. They leave stuff out. The King James Version puts it in there, it leaves it in there, but it identifies it and lets you know there's some debate about this passage. Whether it belongs here, whether it belongs in this spot, or whether it is accurate. So it puts everything in and it lets the reader decide for yourself, which I think is the best approach. Some of the negatives, perhaps, of the New King James is, again, based upon the Textus Receptus. It may not be the most accurate manuscript basis. Still very, very, very accurate, but just maybe not the most that we have available. Many of those same arguments against the King James Version still remain, as minor as those arguments are, they still remain. One thing about that the New King James was great about translating consistently. They don't do a good job with the definite article, the word an and the. Sometimes the is a very important word to have in there, but it seems to be sort of inserted and left out kind of willy-nilly sometimes, and it's important when you're talking about, for example, faith versus the faith, or law, the general principle of law in Romans, versus the law, which is specifically referring to the law of Moses. Sometimes that's important to know. And the New King James doesn't always do that consistently. Any questions, comments about New King James? The NIV, here we go. The NIV, the New International Version, was published in 1978. One of the good things about it is that it does use the critical text, the eclectic text, which again is that body of manuscripts that's very numerous, very old. Say what you will about the NIV, it is very readable. The publishers of the NIV, the committee, was trying to strike a balance between something that was readable, easily understood, and trying to find that line between the word-for-word translation and a thought-for-thought translation, which is sometimes called dynamic equivalence, where they say, well, this is what the writer was trying to say. Not that they're trying to insert their own ideas in always necessarily, they're just trying to get at the meaning of it and convey that to the reader. Sometimes they do a good job at that, many times they don't. But that's one of those places where you start getting into dangerous territory, where you have the judgment of a human trying to determine what God really meant by that, when we don't have the original autographs. So, that was what they were trying to do with the NIV. Make it more readable, more modern, easily understood, not quite so technical and clunky. The negatives on the NIV, though, are many see that there is too much of this dynamic equivalence, where they say, well, this is what it, instead of saying word for word what it says, we'll just try to convey what it really means. Many times that results in a watering down, a dilution, a smoothing out of a text that really shouldn't be smoothed out. Sometimes God wants those sharp edges in there, if you'll understand my meaning. This is an opportunity for doctrinal error to begin to creep in with this noble intention of trying to smooth things out and make it understandable. It loses the focus of it. It makes it fuzzier sometimes. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 18, can somebody with the King James Version please read Romans 7:18?
For I know that in me dwelleth no good thing, for to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not.
7:18?
That's Romans.
Romans 7:18.
Yes, that's the King James. New King James mentions flesh.
Okay, yeah, there we
For I
go.
now know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find.
So that verse says, Paul is saying, nothing good dwells in my flesh. He's saying, I have nothing inherently good within me as a human being. Righteousness completely depends upon God imparting that to us through Christ. So that word flesh is the Greek word sarx, and it means flesh. You know, that's what it means. So, in the New International Version, they translate that word flesh as sinful nature. I know that nothing good dwells in me because of my sinful nature. So you can see very quickly we're getting into the area of original sin. That, well, I'm lost from the beginning because I have this sinful nature born within me. So now we start to see doctrinal error really begin to creep in. This is what you were talking about, Paul.
Well, Psalms 51:5 is really, in my opinion, a better example of that. This works. Psalms 51:5 clearly said, it's clearly translated as David saying he was born with sin. That's incredibly dangerous. In fact, I'll just tell you right now, I think that's dangerous enough right there to discount the NIV as having any worth. Seriously. We can sit here and say that we can find places where somebody did something well, but that is absolutely enough to cost someone their soul. And what it is, it becomes false teaching. That's what it is.
It does. It can very easily get into that, yeah. When you start teaching about original sin is not a doctrinal truth. And yeah, Psalm 51:5 is another place for that.
And they did use eclectic text, but they also, I believe, had an eclectic attitude towards the men that did it. There were, 42, what were there? There were a large number. There was supposedly a member of the church on this group. He should be ashamed of himself, because I think people got to put their own everybody got to throw an ingredient in the stew.
Well,
And, yeah, anyway.
Well, just because they use the eclectic text, just because they use the majority text, doesn't mean they're going to translate it accurately. That was the basis of it, but we see that they took some liberties with it, so that's not always a guarantee. Again, so that knife cuts both ways. But yeah, that is a big problem. There's another one, if we look over 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8, can somebody read that from the New King James? 1 Peter 2:8, I had that a second ago. Yeah.
And a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble being disobedient to the word to which they also were appointed.
Disobedience to which they were appointed, okay? I did not bring a copy of the NIV up here with me. So we see there, the doom to which they were appointed. The NIV reading really pushes that towards the idea of predestination. So we've already talked about, it's already pushing the idea of original sin, and not just here, but it's in several places. Every place that flesh is translated as sinful nature. But this one here is talking about predestination. 1 Peter 3:21 is one of the clearest passages in the Bible about the necessity of baptism, and yet the NIV will suggest, man, I wish I had brought one.
Do you
Grab one,
want,
but
I
I didn't.
have it on my phone.
Okay, see what that, if you can pull that up
Do
quick.
you want 1 Peter 2:8?
Just 1 Peter 3:21.
Oh, okay. Let me go back.
I thought I had it in my notes, so I didn't bring one up here, but I don't. I just have the reference.
Okay, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
This water that saves you also. Well, what also saved me? Why? Confessing the name of Christ, inviting Him into your heart, the sinner's prayer, of course. Everybody understands that. So there's a great opportunity for error, and what Paul said is very good advice. This is why I really don't use the NIV for anything, because it's just as much as if I'm talking to somebody with an old King James that doesn't have a Bible background. You know, we were talking last week about how we have to sort of translate the translation. We have to do the same thing with the NIV. You have to say, well, now we've read this. That's not really what it says. Let me explain to you what it really means. Well, again, you're just adding a step and an opportunity for confusion. So there are other places in the NIV that promote the idea that hell is not eternal. The idea of annihilation, that it's just a temporary thing, and then at the final judgment, all the wicked will just simply be annihilated, winked out of existence. Jesus himself said that he uses the same word to describe everlasting life and everlasting torment. So if heaven doesn't last forever, then hell won't either, and vice versa.
And that's why I said the gentleman that is accredited with being a member of the church, he should have, I am staunch about this, and we need to think about this. He should have removed himself when he found out he wasn't going to have enough influence to correct some of those clearly obvious huge errors. Because we have a lot of people that carry that, and it's not a good choice. It's not the best choice.
I've been in many churches of Christ, buildings,
Oh, they're everywhere.
and the Pew Bible is an NIV.
More than not. And that should be recognized. And what happens, I really believe, is that we just get emotional about things. We believe, we sometimes don't sit back and say, literally millions of people have been taught the Bible and converted by the Bible by these older transcripts or manuscripts or translations that might be archaic language. That may, look, we can have an archaic thee and thou, or we can have something that doesn't teach God's truth. And
I would rather explain superfluity of naughtiness than original sin or,
I would
or
too.
predestination. That's my personal
And
preference.
there's people that I love dearly that say, but you can also teach the truth with NIV. Oh, it's hard, and especially if you've got someone that's well-trained in how to use it, that wants to tell you hell's not permanent, that wants to tell you you're born with sin, that wants to tell you baptism. You know, if you deal with a real novice, maybe you could do that, but it's just, to me, it's like, there's a lot of things in life that we can't choose the best because something's in the way. We can't choose the best car because we can't afford it. We can't live in the best state with weather because we don't have jobs, whatever. This is something so simple. If there is a best option, why do we refuse it? Why don't we just use it? Why do we try to assimilate everything to fit because we want to do something? Just, you know, that's part of humbling ourselves. It just, let's find what's the safest and the best. It doesn't cost any more, it takes no more effort, it takes no more work. And I think that we just, I know a lot of these things were done well intended. I understand. I will give the benefit of the doubt. But the constant new editions and new translations and all these things, I believe the hidden agenda more times than not is to twist things to the way that a certain group wants them.
Well, I'll show you in just a couple seconds with some other versions.
And I'll
Some of the denominational ones we'll look at here with just that idea. We're heading down that direction, and we'll see what happens when you do have people that do have an agenda regarding translation.
There was something, I see you have it listed here where the NIV does a better job of the book. And I think you talked earlier about sometimes the majority is a little more, I don't want to say accurate, but,
I think we understand what we mean by that.
yeah. I found too, in my Old Testament study, that sometimes the Septuagint makes more sense than the Masoretic, which is what the King James uses, I
Yeah.
believe. And, but I have found in those cases, I'm not saying this is true for the NIV, in those cases, it's not a salvation issue.
No.
Now, here where the NIV, yeah, there are salvation issues. But it's not a fact of using the Textus Receptus or the
majority text.
majority text. It's how the people translate it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, every version you see, in the beginning, there is an introduction, there's a foreword, and it will often tell you what the aim of the translators was, what their goals were, and sometimes that reveals some things there. I want to make sure we get through these
Yeah,
here.
I think the other thing that's important, because I have had people who will only use the NIV,
Mhm.
that I've studied with. You have to go back and find examples that say, no, complete obedience to whatever God is asking the person to do, comes before salvation. So instances like Noah's Ark, the Jews crossing the Red Sea, Naaman's leprosy. You see complete obedience
Right.
to what God is saying to do, and there's usually some physical component to it.
Well, sure.
And then you say, that's when salvation happens, and you have to use that as, this is a constant example God has given us.
Well, see, and this is a good thing to know. This is a good thing to know because like, if you have somebody who does, if you're studying the Bible with somebody and they have an NIV, you should know ahead of time, I'm going to have to address some of these areas in their
Yeah.
translation.
And the question, you either have to address the translation issue right away, or you're gonna have to address it by examples. You have to figure out which one the person's gonna be receptive to.
Real quick, I know you want to get through it, and you deserve to get through this. If someone sat down with you and you were going to study how to be saved and they wanted to use the Quran, what would you say?
Well, I'd have to disprove the Quran, would I not?
But before you disprove it, but would you even attempt to go into it? Wouldn't you say, we can't use this? It's not.
Yeah, I would.
I think we're close, but anyway, I'll
Yeah.
stop there so you can finish.
No,
It's like the Mormon Bible.
Well,
Before you get into it, you go to where the birth of Christ, and you show them that the Bible and the Mormon Bible don't coincide.
It
One
doesn't,
says
it doesn't take too
Jerusalem,
long,
one says-
it doesn't take too long to show
No,
conflict.
but that's what I'm saying, that's what you'd have to do first, the same thing with, if you had the Quran, you'd have to, first of all, you'd have to show where the Quran is error. And then you wouldn't have to use it.
Right.
So you wouldn't go into the study of, with the Quran, you wouldn't go into the study actually with the NIV, really. If you went and showed them the error with the NIV before you actually studied.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, my point is you have people who are ignorantly using the NIV, thinking there's nothing wrong with it, and then you have people who are using it because it sides with their point of view. There's two different there. Now, I think the person who's ignorantly using it, you can sit down with the King James, they have an NIV, you can read back and forth, and you can talk about it and show where one is there and one's not. You don't have to address the translation right away. I think you can talk with them and lead them there.
That's
The person who
possibly
is,
true.
the person who is using it because it agrees with their point of view, you have to have that argument before you do anything. That's my difference is when do you have that argument? Because it's gonna come up eventually. But what I've done in the past is if somebody is just ignorantly using the NIV, and I've run into that, then I've sat down with the King James and we've talked and shown the differences and saying, well, this isn't correct or this is, and you go through it, and then you have that conversation later and say, well, maybe you shouldn't be using the NIV. But the person who is adamant because it agrees with their use, then you're gonna have to have that argument right away. Same with somebody who ignorantly comes to you with the Quran, right? You're gonna have to show them, well, here's the difference, here's why it doesn't make sense, here's the problems with it. Versus somebody who's adamant because it's the only way, you're gonna have to say, no.
Well,
You get what I'm saying?
And again, we're taking
Yeah.
our obvious time. We'll just
It-
go,
it's
we'll
fine.
we'll just go over.
We'll finish it up
Yeah,
next.
I'm just
But
saying,
I don't disagree with
Yeah.
that, but the theory of that, the concept of that is, let's take it to the next step. There's some truth to that,
Yeah.
that you've got people that don't know different. The next step would be, would, what Rob just mentioned, would elderships put the Quran as the Bible of choice in the auditorium for churches? And we just compared the two.
right.
So just think about that.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't do that, and I don't think you should put the NIV either.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
Well,
Yeah.
putting a version of the Bible in the, if it's a word-for-word translation, you'd probably be okay. Whether it's the NIV, or not the NIV, whether it's the New American Standard or the New King James or the King James or the American Standard or the English, those would probably be okay because your word for word is gonna be accurate or more accurate. Where you get into trouble is when you go with the thought for thought. That's where you run into your problems, putting NIV, Revised Standard, and those in, that's where you get into trouble.
I would agree with that statement. That's kind of reflected on that chart there where it shows you sort of the different groupings. There's really three. There's word for word, there's dynamic equivalence, and then there's paraphrase. Those are really the three categories. And I would agree with you. I think any in that word for word category, pretty safe ground. There's some nuances, some differences, but overall, the teaching is going to be the same. And then when you get into the dynamic equivalence, in that collection of translations, that's where you start to get some of these, like these doctrinal errors, these shadings of a word that push it toward a doctrinal position, an error on something like predestination, original sin. And that's when you get into an area where you really need to be aware. And that's really what this class is about. It's just being aware of what some of those differences are. So we will finish that up next week and then get into, y'all dodged a bullet. In this class material that I prepared, I do have actually a very basic overview of Greek. I have graciously decided to spare you all that doldrum. It would be helpful, it would be valuable, but I just don't think it would be the best use of our time. I don't want to make this a long drawn out thing, so if you're interested in knowing some things about the Greek, let me know, I'll get you some material. But we'll get into really the meat of all of this, which is basic hermeneutics, which is how to study the Bible, which is what we're doing, about how to look at the Bible and understand it, look at it in a way that we can sort of break it down and look at the meaning. So I appreciate all of your comments, I really do. It doesn't bother me because this is what I wanted to have with this class. I don't want this to be just a dry lecture of me up here spewing information at you. We need to be discussing these things. I want to make sure that we all have a clear understanding of them. These are tools. How can we use these tools? Which are the best? Which have some cautions? I mean, if you use a chainsaw, that's a useful tool, but you better be aware of some of the dangers inherent with it, or you can get hurt or hurt someone else. So that's what I hope to accomplish by all this, is just making you aware of some of the differences. And again, like some things to be aware of. I'm really glad you brought that up, Stephen, about, you know, if somebody uses the NIV because it defends their views about some things, that's a good thing to know where some of these places are, that you could show them. Say, hey, are you aware that this says this, but all of the other translations are translated this way? Why do you think that is? That'd be a good discussion to have. And we'll see this kind of principle come out a little more when we look at like the New World Translation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Some things like that, where there's just flat out blatant changes that are made to defend false doctrine.
My issue too, and I think people here know me well enough, but I don't believe the King James is the only version you should carry. I have a New King James right here. I have an ESV I use. I don't think that it's the only thing. And I also don't think that the NIV is the only thing that ought to be tossed. My concern and my passion is that the NIV is the most apparent potential issue in the Lord's church today. It's the thing that's on top of the list from all the people that carry it, that don't understand the problems with it, to people to elderships and men putting it in the pews. You're right, New World, the Children's Living Bible, those are as bad or worse. But they're not immediate issues right now. But for 25, 30 years now, the NIV has been. So it's not that I hate the NIV more than anything else, or it's not that I don't think you can use. It is I think it's where our focus on should be right now for the Lord's church.
Well, the NIV is the best-selling version.
There you go. That kind of just,
That alone tells us we need to know what it says. We need to know where it's wrong.
it's been marketed well.
See that? Yeah.
I think the big problem comes from where you have these grades, reading grade levels on the next page. I don't think they're actually, I think they're not very accurate, but the problem is the NIV is easier to understand the words used